On the evening of November 17, 1983, a taxi driver named Klaus Werner Hartmann picked up a fare outside the Friedrichstrasse station in West Berlin and set in motion a chain of events that would expose one of the most sensitive intelligence operations of the entire Cold War. Hartmann was 42 years old, a lifelong Berliner who had driven a taxi through the divided city for nearly 15 years, and who by his own later admission had seen enough unusual behavior from passengers that very little surprised him anymore. But what he witnessed that night, what he stumbled into purely by accident while trying to make a living in a city that sat at the fault line between two superpowers, would ultimately unravel a covert prisoner exchange that both the CIA and the KGB had spent 18 months carefully orchestrating, and would force American and Soviet intelligence officials to recalibrate how they conducted their most secretive operations on European soil. The pickup itself seemed routine. A man in his late 50s, wearing a dark overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase, flagged down Hartmann's Mercedes taxi near the station entrance at approximately 8:35 in the evening. The man spoke German with what Hartmann would later describe as a slight American accent, the kind of linguistic marker that was common enough in West Berlin, where American military personnel and intelligence officers had maintained a significant presence since the end of World War II. The passenger requested a destination that struck Hartmann as unusual, not because it was suspicious, but because it was oddly specific. He asked to be taken to the Charlottenburg district, to a residential street called Kantstrasse, to a specific address, number 147, but with an additional instruction. He wanted Hartmann to approach from the west, to drive past the building once without stopping, and then to circle back and drop him at the corner rather than directly in front of the address. Most taxi drivers in West Berlin in 1983 understood that their city was a place where espionage was simply part of the landscape. The divided city served as a meeting point, a trading post, and a battlefield for intelligence agencies from both sides of the Iron Curtain. American, British, French, and West German intelligence operated openly and covertly throughout the Western sectors. Soviet, East German, and other Warsaw Pact services maintained equally active networks. The result was a kind of permanent shadow war, where everyone knew the game was being played, but where the specific moves remained deliberately obscure. Hartmann had driven CIA officers before, though he'd never known for certain that's who they were. He'd driven Soviet diplomats, KGB operatives working under various covers, East German defectors, and journalists who were probably working for someone's intelligence service. He'd learned not to ask questions, not to engage in conversation beyond what was necessary, and certainly not to remember faces or destinations once the fare was paid and the passenger departed. But something about this particular passenger made Hartmann pay closer attention. It wasn't anything the man said or did explicitly. It was the combination of small details that experienced drivers notice. The way the man kept checking his watch every 2 or 3 minutes. The way he positioned himself in the back seat to maintain a view through the rear window. The way his hand rested on the briefcase, not casually, but with a kind of protective tension that suggested whatever was inside mattered more than the briefcase itself. When they reached Kantstrasse, and Hartmann drove past number 147 as instructed, the passenger leaned forward slightly, scanning the street, the parked cars, the windows of surrounding buildings. Then he sat back and told Hartmann to circle the block and return. What happened when they pulled up to the corner near the address was something Hartmann wouldn't have thought twice about under normal circumstances. The passenger paid the fare, added a modest tip, and exited the taxi. He walked approximately 30 meters to the entrance of number 147, a 4-story apartment building with the kind of post-war architecture that characterized much of West Berlin's reconstruction. He pressed the intercom button, spoke briefly to whoever answered, and was buzzed inside. The entire transaction took less than 3 minutes, and under any other circumstances, Hartmann would have driven away immediately, back toward the city center to look for his next fare. But as Hartmann was about to pull away from the curb, his attention was caught by movement further down the street. Another car, a dark-colored Audi sedan, had been parked approximately 50 meters away, with its engine running and its headlights off. As soon as Hartmann's passenger entered the building, the Audi's driver turned on the headlights and began driving slowly toward number 147. The car pulled into a parking space almost directly in front of the building's entrance and sat there, engine idling. Hartmann, operating on nothing more than curiosity and a vague sense that something about the timing seemed coordinated, decided to remain parked where he was. He turned off his taxi's roof light, indicating he was off duty, and waited. What followed over the next 22 minutes was a sequence of movements that, when viewed individually, might have seemed innocuous, but that collectively suggested something carefully choreographed. At approximately 9:03, less than 5 minutes after the Audi arrived, a second car approached from the opposite direction. A BMW sedan that drove past the building, turned around at the end of the block, and parked on the opposite side of the street, roughly 40 meters from the entrance. At 9:11, a man emerged from number 147. He was younger than the passenger Hartmann had dropped off, perhaps in his mid-30s, wearing a gray jacket and dark pants. He walked directly to the Audi, got into the passenger seat, and the car immediately drove away, heading east toward the city center. 3 minutes later, at 9:14, another man exited the building. This one was older, probably in his 60s, with white hair and a distinctive limp that suggested an old injury. He walked to the BMW, which had remained parked across the street, and got in. The BMW pulled away, heading in the opposite direction from the Audi, west toward Charlottenburg Palace. And finally, at 9:17, Hartmann's original passenger emerged from number 147, still carrying his briefcase, and began walking back toward the corner where Hartmann's taxi was parked. The man seemed relaxed now, his posture less tense than it had been during the ride over. He walked past Hartmann's taxi without appearing to notice it, continued to the end of the block, and disappeared around the corner. Hartmann sat in his taxi for another 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what he'd observed. He wasn't a spy, wasn't trained in surveillance or counter-surveillance, didn't have any particular expertise in recognizing intelligence operations. But he'd lived in Berlin long enough, and had driven enough unusual passengers through enough unusual situations that he understood instinctively when something didn't fit the normal patterns of the city. 3 men entering and leaving the same building within 15 minutes. 3 different cars arriving and departing in what seemed like a deliberately sequenced pattern. The timing, the coordination, the careful spacing, all of it suggested a meeting that had been planned with significant attention to operational security. Most people would have driven away. Most people would have dismissed it as none of their business, as something that probably had a perfectly innocent explanation, or as something that, even if it wasn't innocent, was best left alone in a city where curiosity about the wrong things could lead to serious problems. But Hartmann made a decision that night that would alter the trajectory of his life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He decided to write down what he'd seen, not because he planned to do anything with the information, but because something about the sequence of events bothered him enough that he wanted a record, even if only for himself. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, the kind he used to track his fares and mileage for tax purposes, and he began writing. The time he'd picked up the passenger at Friedrichstrasse, the route they'd taken, the address on Kantstrasse, the arrival of the Audi and the BMW, the sequence of people entering and leaving number 147, the directions the cars had taken when they departed. He noted the approximate times for each event, and he noted one additional detail that would prove critical when the information eventually reached the right people: the Audi's license plate. He'd caught a glimpse of it when the car's headlights came on, and he'd made a mental note of the number, as taxi drivers often did, when they witnessed traffic violations or accidents. He wrote the license plate number in his notebook, closed it, and drove back toward the city center. 3 days later, on November 20th, Klaus Hartmann was approached by a man while having lunch at a cafe near Alexanderplatz. The man was in his 40s, spoke fluent German with no discernible accent, and introduced himself as Werner Schmidt, claiming to be a journalist working for a West German newspaper. He asked if he could join Hartmann for a few minutes, said he was working on a story about everyday life in West Berlin, and was interested in talking to people like taxi drivers who saw the city from a unique perspective. Hartmann, who was used to being approached by journalists, agreed. The conversation started casually enough. Schmidt asked about how long Hartmann had been driving, whether business was good, what kinds of passengers he typically picked up. But then Schmidt shifted the conversation in a direction that made Hartmann immediately uneasy. He asked whether Hartmann had ever picked up passengers who seemed like they might be involved in intelligence work, whether he'd ever been asked to drive to unusual locations or follow unusual routes, whether he'd ever witnessed anything that struck him as suspicious. Hartmann's first instinct was to end the conversation and leave. But Schmidt seemed to anticipate this reaction, and he said something that stopped Hartmann from standing up. He said he knew that Hartmann had picked up a passenger near Friedrichstrasse station on the evening of November 17th. He knew that the passenger had been dropped at an address on Kantstrasse, and he was interested in knowing whether Hartmann had noticed anything else that evening. Anything unusual. The statement hung in the air between them, and Hartmann understood immediately that Werner Schmidt was not a journalist. The question was who he actually worked for. West German intelligence? American CIA? Or more worryingly, was he East German Stasi or Soviet KGB? Someone who'd been watching the same operation Hartmann had stumbled across and who now needed to know what a random taxi driver might have witnessed. Hartmann made a calculation in that moment, one based not on any particular loyalty or ideology, but on basic self-preservation and a sense of civic responsibility. He told Schmidt that yes, he'd dropped a passenger at that address, and yes, he'd noticed some unusual activity afterward. He described the sequence of cars and people, the timing, the coordination. He mentioned that he'd written down the details in his notebook, including the license plate of one of the vehicles. Schmidt listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When Hartmann finished, Schmidt asked whether Hartmann had told anyone else about what he'd seen. Hartmann said no. Schmidt then asked whether Hartmann still had the notebook with the license plate number. Hartmann said yes. Schmidt reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card with nothing on it except a phone number. He slid it across the table and told Hartmann that if he was willing to help, he should call that number within the next 24 hours and ask for Herr Müller. Then Schmidt stood up, thanked Hartmann for his time, and left the cafe. Klaus Hartmann did not call the number that day, or the next day. He went home, he told his wife Greta about the encounter, and they discussed what, if anything, he should do. Greta's first reaction was concern. She reminded him that they had 2 teenage children, that they had a comfortable life, and that getting involved in intelligence matters, no matter which side was asking for help, was dangerous. People disappeared in Berlin, People were arrested on fabricated charges. People had their lives destroyed for reasons they never fully understood. But Hartman couldn't shake the feeling that what he'd witnessed on Kantstrasse had been important, and that if someone was asking him for information, it was because they needed it. On November 23rd, 6 days after he'd picked up the passenger and 3 days after meeting Schmidt, Klaus Hartman called the phone number. A woman answered, her tone professional and efficient. Hartman asked for Herr Müller. There was a pause, then the woman asked him to hold. A minute later, a man's voice came on the line. The man identified himself as Müller and asked Hartman to come to an address in the Dahlem district the following afternoon at 2 o'clock. He gave Hartman the address, told him to come alone, and hung up. The address turned out to be a nondescript office building near the Free University of Berlin. Hartman arrived at the specified time, was met in the lobby by a man who looked nothing like Werner Schmidt, but who seemed to be expecting him, and was escorted to a third-floor office. Inside the office were 2 men. One was Schmidt, though he didn't acknowledge their previous meeting. The other was an American, mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent years working in difficult environments. The American introduced himself as Mr. Carpenter, though Hartman understood immediately that it wasn't his real name. Carpenter spoke German reasonably well, but with an unmistakable American accent. What followed was an interview that lasted nearly 3 hours. Carpenter and Schmidt asked Hartman to describe, in as much detail as possible, everything that had happened on the evening of November 17th. They wanted to know about the passenger he'd picked up, his appearance, his behavior, his exact words. They wanted to know about the route they'd taken, the timing, the address on Kantstrasse. They wanted to know about the Audi and the BMW, about the 3 men who'd entered and exited the building, about the sequence of departures. Carpenter was particularly interested in the license plate number Hartman had written down. He asked Hartman to repeat it twice, had him write it on a piece of paper, and then asked Schmidt to verify it against something in a file folder that was sitting on the desk. When Hartman finished his account, Carpenter sat back in his chair and was silent for nearly a minute. Then he told Hartman something that, even years later, Hartman would remember with absolute clarity. He said that what Hartman had witnessed was a prisoner exchange, a covert operation that had taken years to negotiate, and that involved the release of intelligence officers from both sides who had been imprisoned for espionage. He said that the operation was supposed to have been carried out in complete secrecy, with layers of security designed to ensure that no one, especially not foreign intelligence services, would be able to observe or interfere with the exchange. And he said that the fact that a taxi driver had stumbled across it, had documented it, and was now sitting in a CIA safe house describing it in detail represented a catastrophic security failure. Carpenter explained that the building on Kantstrasse had been chosen specifically because it was considered secure, because it was in a quiet, residential neighborhood where unusual activity wouldn't be noticed, and because it provided multiple exit routes that could be used to transport the exchanged individuals to different safe houses. The Audi had been carrying an East German intelligence officer who the CIA had been holding in detention for nearly 2 years. The BMW had been transporting a CIA officer who the KGB had arrested in Moscow in 1981 and who had been sentenced to 15 years in a Soviet labor camp. The exchange had been negotiated through back channels over 18 months, with both sides agreeing to release their prisoners simultaneously in a neutral location where verification could occur without either side gaining a tactical advantage. But now, Carpenter said, the operation had been compromised. Not because of any failure on the part of the CIA or KGB operatives involved, not because of surveillance or counter-surveillance that either side had conducted, but because a taxi driver, acting on nothing more than curiosity and civic instinct, had observed and documented enough details that the entire operational method was now exposed. Carpenter told Hartman that the KGB would almost certainly learn, if they hadn't already, that the exchange had been witnessed. They would identify Hartman through the taxi company's dispatch records. They would know that he'd been parked on Kantstrasse at the relevant time. And they would want to know what he'd seen and who he'd told. The implication was clear. Klaus Hartman was now a security risk, both to the CIA and potentially to himself. Carpenter asked Hartman what he wanted, whether he understood the situation he was now in, whether he had any idea how much danger he'd potentially placed himself and his family in by calling that phone number. Hartman's response, according to the debriefing notes that would later be declassified, was straightforward. He said he'd thought he was doing the right thing. He said he hadn't known he was witnessing an intelligence operation. He said he'd simply been a taxi driver trying to make sense of something unusual he'd seen, and that when someone had asked him about it, he'd told the truth. What happened next represented one of the more unusual decisions made by CIA officers operating in Berlin during the Cold War. Rather than simply warning Hartman to keep quiet and hoping the KGB wouldn't track him down, Carpenter decided to bring him further into the operation. He told Hartman that the CIA needed to know whether the Stasi or KGB had also been watching the Kantstrasse location. If they had, then the operation was completely blown, and future exchanges would need to be conducted through entirely different methods and locations. If they hadn't, then the compromise was limited to Hartman's observation, and damage control might still be possible. Carpenter proposed that Hartman continue his normal taxi driving routine, but that he pay attention to whether he was being followed or approached by anyone else asking about the night of November 17th. If he was, he should immediately contact the CIA using a phone number Carpenter gave him. In exchange, the CIA would provide Hartman with protection, including relocating his family if necessary, and would compensate him for the disruption to his life. Hartman agreed, though he later admitted that he had no clear sense at the time of what he was agreeing to or what the consequences might be. Over the next 3 weeks, Klaus Hartman drove his taxi through West Berlin and waited to see whether anyone else would approach him. He varied his routes slightly, paid more attention to cars that might be following him, and tried to determine whether his apartment building or his favorite cafe were under surveillance. On December 9, 1983, he got his answer. A man approached him outside his apartment building as he was returning home from his shift. The man spoke German with a noticeable Russian accent and identified himself as a representative of a cultural organization interested in promoting better understanding between East and West. He asked whether Hartman would be willing to meet with him to discuss his experiences as a taxi driver in a divided city. The request was phrased politely, but the underlying message was clear. The KGB knew who Hartman was and wanted to talk to him. Hartman told the man he wasn't interested and walked into his building. He immediately went to his apartment, told his wife what had happened, and called the number Carpenter had given him. Within 2 hours, Carpenter and Schmidt were at his apartment. They told Hartman that he and his family needed to leave Berlin immediately. The fact that the KGB had approached him directly meant they knew he'd witnessed the exchange, and it was only a matter of time before they escalated their efforts to find out. What he'd told the CIA, Carpenter said arrangements had been made to relocate the Hartman family to West Germany, to the city of Hamburg, where they would be given new identities and financial support while the situation was resolved. The Hartman family left Berlin on December 11, 1983. They were driven to Hamburg by CIA officers, provided with an apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, and given documentation under assumed names. Klaus was told he could no longer work as a taxi driver, as his face and profession were too easily identifiable. Instead, he was given a position in the administrative office of a shipping company that had been cleared by West German intelligence to employ individuals in sensitive situations. His children were enrolled in new schools under their new names, and for the next 8 months, they lived in a kind of suspended reality, knowing they'd been forced out of their home because of a chance observation that had intersected with the secret war between superpowers. The resolution, when it came, was both anticlimactic and profound. In August 1984, Carpenter contacted Hartman and told him that the situation had been resolved through diplomatic channels. The CIA had informed the KGB through back-channel communications that the Kantstrasse location had been compromised by a civilian witness, that the witness had been cooperative with Western intelligence, and that future prisoner exchanges would need to be conducted through alternative methods that didn't rely on unsecured locations in residential neighborhoods. The KGB, in turn, had agreed to cease any operations targeting Hartman or his family, acknowledging that his involvement had been accidental and that pursuing him further would only draw more attention to an operation both sides wanted to keep quiet. Carpenter explained that the Kantstrasse exchange had actually worked, that both prisoners had been successfully transferred and were now free. But the method, which had been used for at least 3 previous exchanges over the past several years, could no longer be used. Both the CIA and KGB would need to develop new protocols, new locations, and new security measures to ensure that future exchanges wouldn't be vulnerable to accidental observation by civilians who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. Klaus Hartman and his family returned to Berlin in September 1984, nearly 9 months after they'd left. They moved back into their apartment on Schöneberg, and Hartman resumed working as a taxi driver. But the experience had changed him in ways that he found difficult to articulate. He'd seen behind the curtain of the intelligence war that defined Cold War Berlin. He'd learned that ordinary decisions, like writing down a license plate number or calling a phone number on a business card, could have extraordinary consequences. And he'd understood, perhaps more clearly than most civilians ever would, that the city he lived in was a place where 2 incompatible systems existed in uneasy proximity, and where the friction between them created situations that were dangerous, absurd, and deeply human, all at once. The Kantstrasse incident, as it came to be known within CIA and KGB circles, led to significant changes in how prisoner exchanges were conducted between East and West. The casual approach that had characterized some exchanges in the early 1980s, the assumption that residential neighborhoods in West Berlin could serve as neutral ground without risk of observation, was replaced by more formalized protocols. Future exchanges were moved to more secure locations, often outside of Berlin entirely, or were conducted through diplomatic channels that provided official cover and legal protection. The era of improvised exchanges in apartment buildings was over, ended not by some sophisticated counterintelligence operation, but by a taxi driver who'd been curious enough to watch and careful enough to write down what he'd seen. Klaus Hartman never spoke publicly about his role in the incident during his lifetime. The agreement he'd reached with the CIA included a confidentiality clause that prevented him from discussing the details with anyone except his immediate family. But after his death in 2009, his wife Greta authorized the release of certain documents related to the case, including Hartman's original notebook with the license plate number and the handwritten account he'd prepared at the CIA's request in December 1983. These documents, along with declassified CIA and West German intelligence files, provide a remarkably complete picture of how an ordinary citizen became briefly entangled in the machinery of Cold War espionage. The broader question raised by the Hartman case is one that intelligence historians continue to debate. How many other civilians stumbled across sensitive operations during the Cold War but never reported what they'd seen? How many taxi drivers, waiters, hotel clerks, shop owners, and apartment building superintendents observed unusual behavior, noted suspicious patterns, and then simply went on with their lives without ever knowing they'd glimpsed the hidden war being waged around them? The Kantstrasse incident became known precisely because Hartman chose to write down what he'd seen and chose to cooperate when he was approached. But for every Klaus Hartman who documented and reported an observation, there were likely dozens or hundreds of others who saw similar things and forgot them by the next morning. The CIA officer who operated under the name Carpenter in 1983 was later identified, after his retirement from the agency, as Robert James Keller, a career intelligence officer who had served in Berlin from 1979 to 1986. In interviews conducted years later, Keller described the Hartman case as emblematic of one of the fundamental challenges of operating in a city like Berlin. He said that no matter how carefully an operation was planned, no matter how many layers of security were put in place, there was always the possibility that some civilian, operating from completely innocent motives, would observe something they weren't supposed to see. And once that happened, the intelligence agencies on both sides had to make calculations about whether the civilian represented a threat, an opportunity, or simply an unfortunate complication in an already complicated game. Keller's assessment was that Hartman had been lucky. If he'd been approached first by the KGB instead of the CIA, his cooperation might have been coerced rather than voluntary, and the consequences for him and his family could have been far more severe. If he'd chosen not to cooperate with anyone, he might have been left alone, or he might have been pressured by both sides until his life became unbearable. The fact that he made the decisions he did, in the sequence he did, ultimately worked in his favor. But Keller acknowledged that Hartman had no way of knowing that when he first wrote down the license plate number in his notebook. The prisoner exchange that Klaus Hartman accidentally observed on November 17, 1983, involved two individuals whose stories illustrate the human cost of the intelligence war. The East German officer transported in the Audi was later identified as Hans-Dieter Bergmann, a Stasi agent who had been operating in West Berlin under commercial cover until his arrest by West German authorities in 1981. Bergmann had been convicted of espionage and sentenced to 8 years in prison, but his release was negotiated as part of a broader prisoner exchange package that the East German government had been pursuing for more than a year. The CIA officer transported in the BMW was Thomas Randall Mitchell, a case officer who had been stationed in Moscow under diplomatic cover until his arrest by the KGB in 1981. Mitchell had been running a network of sources inside Soviet scientific institutes, gathering intelligence on weapons development and military technology. His arrest and conviction had been a significant loss for the CIA, and negotiations for his release had been ongoing since shortly after his sentencing. The Kantstrasse exchange represented the culmination of those negotiations, and Mitchell's return to the West was considered a major success for American intelligence. Both men resumed their careers after the exchange, though in different capacities. Bergmann continued working for the Stasi until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, after which he disappeared into the chaos of German reunification. Mitchell remained with the CIA, but was reassigned to a desk position at headquarters in Langley, His days of overseas operational work effectively ended by his time in Soviet custody. Neither man ever met Klaus Hartmann, and neither was ever informed that their exchange had been observed and documented by a taxi driver who happened to be parked on the wrong street at the wrong time. The Kantstrasse building, itself number 147, remained a residential apartment building through the end of the Cold War and beyond. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the city began the long process of reunification and reconstruction, the building was renovated and modernized, and new residents moved in who had no idea of its brief moment of significance in the history of Cold War intelligence operations. There is no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate that on a November evening in 1983, 3 men walked through that entrance as part of a carefully negotiated prisoner exchange that was supposed to remain completely secret. Klaus Werner Hartmann died in 2009 at the age of 68, having spent the last 25 years of his life driving a taxi through a reunified Berlin where the wall no longer stood, and where the intelligence war between East and West had given way to different kinds of tensions and different kinds of secrets. His children, who had been teenagers when they were abruptly relocated to Hamburg in 1983, later spoke about how that experience had shaped their understanding of the city they grew up in. They said their father never spoke about the incident, except in the most general terms, that he seemed to regard it as something that had happened to him, rather than something he had chosen, and that he never expressed regret about the decisions he'd made, even when those decisions had forced his family into temporary exile. The story of Klaus Hartmann is not, in the final analysis, a story about heroes or villains, about ideology or betrayal. It's a story about an ordinary person who witnessed something extraordinary and who made a series of choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but that had consequences he could never have fully anticipated. It's a story about how intelligence operations, no matter how carefully planned, remain vulnerable to the unpredictable element of human observation. And it's a story about Berlin in the Cold War, a city where the normal and the clandestine existed in such close proximity that sometimes the line between them disappeared entirely, and where a taxi driver's curiosity could become the thread that unraveled months of careful diplomatic and intelligence work. The CIA's after-action review of the Kantstrasse operation, declassified in 2012, concluded that the security failure was not the result of any individual mistake, but rather a systemic underestimation of how visible certain activities would be in an urban environment. The report recommended that future exchanges be conducted in more controlled settings, with better counter-surveillance measures, and with contingency plans for managing civilian witnesses who might observe sensitive activities. The KGB conducted a similar review, and though their conclusions remain classified in Russian archives, former KGB officers, who were interviewed years later, indicated that the Hartmann incident had been regarded as an embarrassment for Soviet intelligence, a reminder that operational security could never be taken for granted, even in operations that seemed straightforward. For Klaus Hartmann, the lasting impact of that November evening was more personal than historical. He told his wife, years later, that he sometimes thought about the 2 men whose exchange he'd witnessed, wondered whether they'd gone on to have normal lives, whether they'd ever known that their freedom had come at the cost of exposing the very system that had secured it. He wondered whether he'd done the right thing by writing down what he'd seen, by calling that phone number, by agreeing to cooperate with the CIA. He never arrived at a definitive answer to those questions, and perhaps that uncertainty was appropriate for a man who'd found himself, through no fault of his own, caught between 2 systems that operated according to rules he'd never agreed to follow. The taxi he drove on November 17, 1983, a Mercedes sedan with Berlin taxi license plates, was retired from service in 1991 and sold to a private buyer. The notebook where he'd written down the license plate number and the sequence of events on Kantstrasse was donated by his widow to the German Historical Museum in Berlin, where it's now preserved as part of a collection documenting everyday life during the Cold War. The entry for November 17th is brief, just a few lines in Hartmann's careful handwriting, noting the time, the address, and the observations that would change his life. It's the kind of notation that thousands of taxi drivers have made in thousands of notebooks, a routine record of a routine evening. Except that nothing about that evening, as it turned out, was routine at all.